Let's start this session. Welcome to the session. We call this evening session because we had another one earlier, actually in European time. But this session is for those who are on other time zones, if you can say so. But the session is about the future frontiers, the program which we have put together, and it's about the critical shift and scenarios. My name is Karl Friðriksson. I'm CEO of the Icelandic Center for Future Studies. After a few words of mine, we will start the program. Just some housekeeping. Please have a mute on, and I must tell you that this session is recorded, and after the speakers have finished their speeches, we will have a Q&A, and please put your question, comment, and so forth in the chat or Q&A box for a discussion later on. We have fantastic speakers with us, Roha Talvar and David Wood. Roha Talvar is CEO of Fast Future, and David Wood is, while I associate him mostly with the London Futurists, but both Roha Talvar and David Wood and me are members of the Millennium Project, and UK NOTS are part of this program. The other sponsors are Fast Future and the Icelandic Center for Future Studies and the Millennium Project. So Roha Talvar will be the program leader, and David would come on and speak on, or they have their discussion. I don't think I have this longer from my side. Roha Talvar, please take the screen.
Thank you, Karl. So as Karl mentioned, this is part of a broader program of webinars. We'll talk a little bit more about those at the end. But today we really want to focus in on what might shape the next 4 or 5 years, or 3 to 4 years. And we're going to focus on 4 particular topics: climate, economy, global risks, and business. And it's going to just be a conversation between David and I, quite free-flowing if this morning's anything to go by, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. Please do feel free to share any comments you might have in the comments box, and any questions that you want to raise for discussion later, please put them into the Q&A. So let's jump straight in. David, why don't you start by sharing with us some of what you believe are the, if you like, the scariest scenarios around climate that we might have to address in the coming years.
So thanks for the invitation, Rohit and Carol. When you put the overall topic to me, I wondered about some possible shocks, big shifts that I don't think are likely, or not even probable, but there's at least a 10% chance of them happening between now and 2025. And the impact from them would be so large that it is appropriate for us to give some time in advance to thinking, how would we respond? So between now and 2025, I think there's about a 10% chance that the world society will shift into a different mood regarding climate change. It'll move from its present concerned but slow actions phase into something that takes climate change much more seriously, because sadly there could be even more extreme weather. Whether floods or fires, storms or droughts, we could have something even worse, sadly, than we've already experienced. Or we could see growing evidence of tipping points in the global climate system, such as a slowdown in the ocean currents, which has already been detected, or possibly a terrible self-reinforcing forest fire in the Amazon. So all of these things could mean that the public now says, hang on, this has got to be the true #1 priority, and people will have to change, a bit like medical establishment hurried up and changed its approach to vaccines for coronaviruses once COVID had become clearly established in the world. And people made much faster progress with these viruses against vaccines against coronaviruses than had previously been thought possible. I think if there is sufficient public mood change, there could be much faster progress on, I'll just briefly mention two things and then hand back the mic. We could have faster progress on nuclear fusion, which has always been 20 years in the future, but now I think with enough application of artificial intelligence, high temperature superconductors, we could see real breakthroughs happening much faster. And then there's the question of what we all eat. And it's well known that giving large areas of land over to sheep and cattle, which are then slaughtered, is bad for all kinds of things, including being bad for the environment. So there could be an acceleration of focus on lab-grown meat, also called cultivated meat. And it could become a shameful matter to be regularly eating sheep or cows grown in the traditional way.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting. If you take what you've talked about, those potential tipping points, those potential opportunities as well that come from nuclear and changing our consumption patterns, these are all going to feed into the mix, I think, in the next few years. And I think whether it's within the next 3 to 4 years or the next 7 to 8, we'll reach a choice point where, faced with public demand, faced with extreme climatic events, faced with the potential to do something different, organizations are going to have a choice about whether they go all out to hit zero emissions by 2030 or earlier, or before 2040, and the same for nations. And I think there's a good possibility there that some may actually say, we're not going to do it. We're not going, despite the pressure that's there, we're not going to do this because the costs outweigh the potential benefits to us. And actually, we'd rather go for some sort of adaptation strategy where obviously there are costs still associated with it. And part of what I think will feed into that is a deeper understanding of what's going on with offsets. Today, a lot of companies claim that they're achieving zero or getting to zero through their purchase of offsets. Some countries are also doing that. And this is all predicated on the idea that somewhere else in the world, either an equivalent amount of carbon is being absorbed or not being emitted. But the connection between the two is loose. There are lots of attempts at the moment to create more rigorous measurement frameworks. But the risk is that when the data starts to come out, we'll see that we're actually offsetting, we're actually absorbing or reducing the amount of emissions far less than we're buying through the offsets. And then companies will be forced with some very tough choices about to what extent do they change their actual behavior to get to zero. And I don't know how many are ready yet to really have that kind of drastic reduction in their supply chain, miles, in their amount of travel, in the footprint of their own facilities. I think we're going to really be in an interesting situation where it's not guaranteed that the world will make the choice to say, no, let's go full out to hit zero emissions. And that's something that I think then we're having to factor in, and we already are in some of the clients we're working with. We're factoring that possibility into scenarios that says, let's not assume that everyone will just go for zero emissions and we'll amp it all up. Let's also think about the possibility where that doesn't happen.
I'm skeptical about the adaptation possibilities. The idea is, well, if we have to live in a world that's 2 degrees hotter, we can do it. We can move from into different parts of the world. That would be okay if there was a single static change in temperature. But the reality is that the temperature is going to keep on changing, and then there's going to be extreme weather as accompanying this and changes in patterns of weather. So I think the cost of adaptation will be much higher than is often implied. I do like your emphasis, Rohit, on greater transparency, greater clarity as to what companies are really doing. And my advice to all companies is you need to give some time to thinking about possible actions you can take. Now, these actions may not be financially tenable for you at the moment, But you can anticipate that in the future, there may be new government subsidies, there may be taxes, which will mean that what previously was not financially viable becomes financially viable. And if you thought about them in advance, you'll be ready to take advantage of that shift sooner rather than later.
Thank you, that's great. And I think the interesting thing that comes out of that and really feeds into our next topic around economy is that we haven't yet got reasonably robust economic models to say, what would the cost be of really hitting zero versus having to try and adapt? What would the cost of that be to the economy? What would the shocks be? Where would they be felt? And I think that's just one of the elements that's feeding into the next factor that I want to talk about, which is economic volatility. I think what we were seeing towards the end of last year was this sense of growing optimism that we were back on a positive stride. Things were starting to upturn. The travel and tourism industry was starting to boast something close to 2019 numbers in certain areas. A lot of sectors were already doing better than 2019, tech, pharma, and others were catching up again. But it seems that we've almost woken up into 2022 and seen a new set of shocks. And then when we start to look around us, we see that there are a number of fault lines in the global economy, whether it's the size of the global derivatives market, which is estimated to be over $1 quadrillion. Equities are about 125 trillion by comparison. Debt's about 300 trillion. And then there's crypto, which is about 1.8 trillion. All of these are potential fault lines where the valuation of the assets is probably far overstated in the market valuation than the true value of the assets. And all of these are coming together as well to impact the way in which business gets done, the way business gets financed. We're seeing more companies move towards crypto as a means of financing their startup or their spin out rather than going the traditional debt or equity route. And I think all of these are going to feed into a lot of rethinking for nations and businesses around what economic assumptions should we be making? What are the worst case scenarios economically that we need to be prepared for? And how do we start to build a model that could actually operate under our worst possible imagined scenario?
So we futurists often say that the best foresight comes from good hindsight. If we look at the past history of financial crashes, each crash was different from what people were worried about leading up to that. They were fighting the last war, as it were, but the actual circumstances of each financial crash have often been very different. And I fear that there is still lots of uncertainty, stress and strain in the financial system today, which could result in a different kind of collapse and repercussions. It's a bit like in 2008, the problems with the subprime market were mortgage subprime market were compounded by all the derivatives which people had created on top of them, and then the hidden connections between different financial instruments. So banks which thought they had assets which were AAA rated actually were sitting on pretty worthless assets. Could the same thing happen with coming flush out of crypto? I think it's quite likely that many crypto stocks will fall in the next few years. What's less likely, what's less clear is how big implications that will have. I think there's a 10% chance that such an occurrence will actually have wider implications than we are currently expecting. And it could have wide implications on the big banks. It's also going to have wide implications on society, because there's a lot of people who are betting much more than they should of their family savings onto crypto stocks. They believe this is the way in which they as plucky individuals can thrive. And if they lose all of that in large numbers, I worry what the social repercussions will be. It'll be bad for them as individuals. We might see more of this terrible thing called deaths of despair. And at least in some cases, it will drive people to acts of violence, acts of sabotage, acts of hatred, which is understandable against what they perceive as the system as a whole. So I fear that outcome is one thing that's possible for the next few years.
I wonder if those acts, though, might be directed more towards the companies that have made them redundant. because they've automated people out of a job. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that those people who are now able to access crypto in many cases were, if you like, kept out of the traditional financial products market because things were too expensive. I needed $3,000 or $4,000 to buy an Amazon share, but I can buy 1/quintillionth of a Bitcoin, which is down to 18 decimal points. So I can get into that market with $5. Now, as always, buyer beware. But I think the other side of that volatility and that risk is that we're offering a level of inclusivity that we've never seen before. And for most people, what we know is that if they just sit with their money in a traditional savings account, at the moment it's going down in value by 4 or 5% a year. The interest is almost negligible. So you can understand why people are looking at alternatives, even if it's just putting the money into a stable coin and earning a level of interest on that beyond that which they could get from a traditional account. And I think I would be much more worried myself about the collapse of major corporations and the knock-on impacts that could have on pension funds, on tax takes from nations, on employment, than I would be about even 90% of the crypto economy failing, because well over $1 trillion of that is basically in just two parts of it, Ethereum and Bitcoin, or typically it's about $1 trillion between the two of them. And then a significant chunk of the rest is in the next 7 or 8, what you might call blue chip players. So I think it's unlikely that we would see some sort of major crisis. We will obviously see some people who've been foolish in putting too much of their money in, losing out. But I think that risk is there in any financial market. Let's move on to the next topic, though. Let's talk a little bit about the global risks issue that you want to bring up.
I want to talk about the possibilities of growing conflict between some of the large powers in the world. China has been flexing its muscles regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan. Russia is in a dangerous situation with its tanks on the border of Ukraine. And even America can't be guaranteed a stable political environment. There is a risk that in the midterm elections in 2022, the result is going to be a complete logjam, that the various groups of power will be so opposed to each other that no actions is possible, apart possibly from some desperate actions. So I do worry that there are triggers for conflict. I worry that things will happen which aren't particularly intended, but which will come just because of all the accumulation of weaponry. After all, what happened last time there was a Russian incursion into Ukraine in, I think, 2013, there were groups of Russian volunteers who fired anti-aircraft missile into the air, trying to knock out what they thought was a Ukrainian jet plane, and it brought down the Malaysian airliner, plunging 300 people to their deaths. Now, it could be even worse than that, because there are crypto weapons, there are social media distortion weapons, there are possibility of countries using black cash to manipulate each other. There are many people who have been bought by donations and things which lead them to act against their own country's interests and against the interests of peace. And lastly, we shouldn't forget about nuclear weapons. When I grew up, when I was in my late teens and 20s, the world was horrified at the prospect of nuclear war. Well, we've still got that threat hanging over us. And especially if there is more disruption, if there is chaos, if there are political leaders who have no good options left, there are risks of a Dr. Strangelove scenario in which you have the Ukrainian airliner issue magnified with a nuclear dimension. So we've got to put some of our best thinking on how we can de-escalate this tension and come out of it smoothly rather than through a terrible shock.
So many historians are pointing us towards the past and saying, if we look around us, we're seeing all of the same kind of signs of end of empire that we've seen with previous empires, the same sort of overuse of power, the blind adherence to leaders who are in it for themselves, leaders who are disengaged from society or believe they're above the law, and you can look at wherever you want for these examples, populist movements rising that eventually lead to the collapse of empire. How close do you think we are to that kind of scenario? And what would our path be through that to the other side? What might we get on the other side of that if we did have some kind of major scale breakdown?
Well, I think political change can happen a lot faster these days because ideas can spread so much more quickly. And I also think back to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, the removal of the Berlin Wall. That all happened much faster than almost anybody dared to think. So there could be faster changes as a result of the greater connectivity, the greater number of discussions and resources and movements that are online. And it could be terrifying. I don't think we necessarily need to move forwards. We could have, on the one hand, more people acting as autocrats, and that's to be feared because autocrats have no one to constrain them. That's the risk. Democracy, for all its ills and problems, has at least some checks and balances on what the leaders can do. But I look at two examples from the past. I look at what President Richard Nixon did in 1972. He established new relations with Mao Zedong in Beijing. He visited there. He drew Beijing's attention to the Soviet missiles, which were actually photographed as pointing towards China. And he was able to change the geopolitical situation at that time. So subsequently, Nixon called that the week that changed the world. Another example is what the US did earlier in history after the Second World War with their Marshall Plan, in which they invested very wisely in some of the countries that had been decimated by previous struggles. And there is an argument that a lot of the present day problems with Russia and Ukraine were stemming from the fact that when the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't enough true aid from the West to the countries that were devastated, and they have grown up suboptimally as a result, with lots of anger and resentment too.
Interesting. If we were to have a modern era Marshall Plan, who do you think the prime donors would that be? Would it be the Russian oligarchs themselves contributing? Would it be the global array of billionaires who hold the majority of the world's wealth? Or would it be nations going to their bankers and to those same billionaires to borrow the money in order to lend out again? How would we fund that Marshall Plan, and how would we get a buy-in to that new model of how things could be?
Yeah, arguably it was easier in the 1940s because there was less Facebook in these days for people to say, we shouldn't be sending all our money to these strange people in Europe. So that makes things harder, but equally that can become an advantage if there is a groundswell opinion which says, you know, for peace to establish in the world, we need to have good conditions everywhere in the world. And that's sort of recognized with COVID. You know, the idea is that we can't solve COVID in one country unless it's solved worldwide. So there may be a growing public movement and a claim that says, let's ensure that all countries are brought up to a certain level. The recent book by ex-UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown is actually quite good on this. He has given 7 plans to change the world, and it does involve drawing on financial resources of various sorts to ensure that countries don't feel like they're being left behind. That's well worth tracking down, Gordon Brown's book.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that sort of leads us nicely into the final topic, because one of the things that we often hear is that in order to fix any of our ills, whether it's with climate, the economy, geopolitics, governance, people look to the private sector and say the private sector has the models, it has the answers, it has the talents, it has the project management capability to navigate us through something or any of these things. And we see a number of cases where countries are effectively being run at the operational level by management consultancies and the big accountancy firms on a day-to-day basis. And so that starts to raise for us the question of, well, what is the future of the firm in the coming years? What are the shifts that could impact them? And all the things we've just talked about really put us, I think, at an emerging fork in the road now, where on the one hand, we have this view that corporations will increasingly be the center of everything. More and more government activity, more and more social activity, voluntary activity, charity activity will be delivered by corporations because of their efficiencies. And yes, they'll make a profit, but they'll do a better job for all the stakeholders. On the other hand, there's a growing concern that actually today's model of corporation just isn't fit for purpose anymore. With all the shocks we're talking about, with design principles that date back to the formation of the church, with a real struggle in terms of delivering digital transformation. We see figures of up to 80% of digital transformation projects failing to deliver on their investment goals. Then there's a real challenge right now. And I think one of the things we're going to see in the coming years is firms really being forced to reawaken themselves and ask fundamentally difficult questions about, well, what are we here for? What's our purpose? And are we as leadership, as investors, as management, the right people to take this ambition forward? And I think we're going to see some very interesting challenges, not least of which is around technology. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing so many firms struggle today is their inability to wrap their heads around technology and to really reimagine their firm around a technology core. We're still trying to wrap technology around existing processes, around existing assumptions, and most importantly, around the attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and fiefdoms of the people inside those organizations. And so we're seeing a growing interest in this notion of corporation zero, i.e. treating an existing company much more like a startup that says, before we think about the people, the equipment, or the buildings, let's think about what we're actually trying to do, the data that we need to achieve what we need to do, the processes that create and manipulate that data, and let's build the business from the bottom up, from the data and the systems up, simulate that, prove it works, and then work out where we need to inject people, plant, buildings, etc., in order to deliver the fully working solution. And that's very, very different. But we're seeing more and more companies now embracing that idea, because the view that had been there, which was, let's spend that $1 billion, pounds, euros, or whatever to upgrade our existing systems, was really stymieing them, because it's going to take them another 2 or 3 years to get the existing systems sorted out, by which time they're out of date again and they've missed out on market opportunities. And you only have to look at retail for a good example of that, where retailers, whether they're online or offline, are really struggling to get their head around what is a profitable model going forward. What's your take on where business sits in this kind of mix of things we've been talking about?
Well, I agree with you, Rohit. All corporations need to take on certain aspects of the startup corporation, including thinking clearly about what they're trying to do, but also being flexible. Startups are easier to change course. Many traditional companies, they are very good at doing the same thing over and over again, or doing increments of the same thing. They focus on measures such as Six Sigma. How good is their quality control? And that was very important. And that makes sense when things are predictable. But we're going to live in an increasingly volatile, unpredictable world. And therefore, the ability to change course rapidly is going to be more important. And that requires things like doing short sprint experiments. It requires helping people to be more comfortable with failures, because in many of these experiments, they will start off with be failures. And rather than blaming people and leading them out of the organization, there needs to be a greater emotional resilience, a greater emotional intelligence. Some corporations are trying to say, well, we're going to be better at foresight. We're going to study the future and figure out exactly what's going to happen, and we're going to have a huge machine to support that. I think these corporations will fail, because I don't believe anybody can predict the future with great certainty. All you can spot are trends and scenarios, and you need to prepare solutions for some of these trends and scenarios and be able to bring them in quickly if need be, but you can't plan it all out with military precision.
I totally agree. I think on the one hand, as a futurist, I love the fact that so many more organizations are embracing foresight. On the other hand, I'm slightly frustrated, but not surprised that so many are embracing it as though it's a risk function. Just tell me what the risks are, tell me what the future is, and give me the answers, and then we'll build around that. And really just swapping one set of rigidities for another, when we know that predictions and projections really aren't going to take us forward. I think foresight is one of the core things organizations need to embrace, but much more as a tool for learning, much more as a way of helping people learn about what shapes the future and the way in which different scenarios can play out and the way in which we can shape the future as well as be a recipient of it. And I think that's one of the ways that organizations can start to navigate a different path, is developing leaders with a capacity for foresight and building foresight into the way we do everything. So when we do business plans, really asking for a surfacing of the assumptions that sit underneath the plan, and then a view of 2 or 3 different scenarios of what could play out and how well our plan stands up against them, and what are the indicators we need to be tracking to tell us which direction we might be heading in, or what we need to be preparing for because things have changed from our assumptions. And I think that's something that we're not there yet. We're quite a long way off that yet in terms of what most are doing with foresight, but it's a gradual process, but hopefully we'll learn how to do foresight in a far better way. And I think the pandemic has actually accelerated the interest in thinking about the future. Interesting that you mentioned sprints. One of the things I've been hearing recently is a lot of the companies, particularly the ones who've not been doing well with digital transformation, are now banning the term sprint because it got such a bad name during the digital transformation projects, because it was seen as something that did 3 things. One, it burnt the people out who were involved. Secondly, it burnt a lot of cash. And third, it tended to make no difference to corporate performance. So they still wanted to try and do things quickly, still trying to do very focused experiments, but they're looking for a different language around it because it's become slightly debased. Particularly during the pandemic, actually, there were so many people trying to do sprints and they just burnt teams out doing it. So I think we need a new language, but also a new understanding of what it means to deliver quickly. And that's just not a function of putting more pressure on people. It's about changing the mindset of the people around us and creating alignment between a lot of different people on what the goal is we're trying to achieve so that we can get there quickly.
Of course, a sprint isn't about trying to do the same stuff as before, but faster. A sprint is about picking a smaller number of things and doing them very well in a short period of time, and then using that as a learning to see what works and what doesn't work. So I do see what you're mentioning. I do see a reaction against Agile, but it's like reactions against digital transformations, it's reactions against decentralization and blockchain. They're all bad experiences. And sadly, too many companies are being misled by hype of one sort or another. People say, oh, Agile is easy, you can do it like this, digital transformation is easy, AI is easy. It's all hard work. And it requires finding the right partners, people who really you can be trusted in these endeavors. And it requires bringing some of that knowledge in-house as well, frankly, rather than being dependent just on external consultants.
It's an interesting point because so many of these things are tied to technology and technology investment. And we're all familiar with the OECD research that says for all the investment in IT over the 20-year period, there's been almost no impact on productivity. There's another piece of research that someone was telling me about, and I still haven't kind of found the source of it, that's actually trying to map company performance to their IT investment and where any companies have actually associated their improved performance to their investment in IT. And as I understand it, the researchers find almost no correlation between superior performers and their investment in IT. There's a much stronger correlation between their investment in leadership and talent development and their corporate performance. There's a much stronger correlation with ethics and general kind of good housekeeping principles and being a good corporate citizen. And there's a much stronger correlation with a longer term planning horizon than there is with the investment in IT. And that's something I think we also have to wrestle with in the coming years if we really want all these technologies that are coming through to really benefit us rather than just being something else we spend money on.
Exactly.
We have a question here from Carl himself, which says, will there be conflict between companies with the society, for example, because of super artificial intelligence? So will we start to see conflict between individuals and companies because of the ways in which AI or artificial general intelligence or artificial super intelligence get adopted, potentially taking people out of their working roles?
I think we are seeing increasingly winner takes all situations in which the companies that have got the best platform technology aren't just a little bit more successful than the second and third and fourth. They are in some ways leagues behind. These are global things. In the old days, you couldn't travel far to get your supplier, so you picked whichever supplier was convenient. But now these things are available online and at the touch of a button. So the three largest companies in Silicon Valley, by some measures, have got roughly the same revenues as the three largest companies in Detroit going back 30 years or so, the three motor companies, but they have many fewer people working for them, and they have much, much higher share prices. And that indicates an expectation that there will be even more future revenue. So there will be success going to the winners as never before. Mark Andreessen, who was one of the pioneers of the web browser Mozilla, now runs Andreessen Horowitz venture capitalist. He has a famous saying from about 10 years ago: software is eating the world, meaning unless you were good at software, then regardless of which industry you were in, you will be left behind. I think the modern version of that is that software written by AI is eating the world, meaning unless you are really up to date with what AI can do and do it properly, rather than just trying to implement it in a mediocre way, you will leave the competitors behind. And that's great for the small number of companies that will be on top of the world, but it is bad news for the rest of us, especially since these companies will be more and more powerful. And we've already seen some of the leaders of these social media companies thumb their nose at politicians refusing to come to speak to the UK Parliament, for example, and saying, well, no, I'm too busy, frankly. And so it's going to be a major challenge for politicians to ensure that these huge successful companies who could get even more dominant and even more powerful as AI improves, how we keep them under democratic control.
Well, absolutely. If you take the big six tech companies from the US, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, plus throw in Tesla, collectively on a good day, they're worth over 10% of the entire global stock market. But they don't employ anywhere near 10% of the entire global workforce. And the common feature of all those companies is they are the ones who are benefiting from technology. They are the ones who are automating, who are scaling up their platforms, able to increase their revenues and their profitability with relatively low headcount reduction increases, or even moving towards headcount reductions. And that I think is the concern there, that they're pulling away from the pack and the rest don't really know how to keep up. And every sector you talk to now is asking questions like, well, should I be partnering with them? Should I be putting myself up for sale to them as a bank? Because they're not going to buy all banks. They just want one set of expertise. Or do I do a joint venture with them? Or do I look to government to regulate them? Increasingly, the conversation in almost every other industry is about how do we respond to the tech players and their massive capabilities around data management, which is at the core of every sector now, and their ability to build and deliver the applications, and most importantly, their ability to manage relationships with hundreds of millions, if not billions of users that most of us have struggled with. And I think that is also going to be one of the dominant conversations in the business landscape going forward, is how do you regulate it when everyone wants to be bought by Google, by an Amazon, a Google, a Microsoft, or a Facebook, or an Apple? What happens? Will we lose all sorts of monopoly regulation because that's the only way of keeping jobs? is by allowing these people to buy, or will we see some radical shifts in governments that require the state to have a super stake in these firms, or the IP ownership to be transferred to the state? Will we see some very different models emerge for how we protect society and ensure some sort of vaguely level playing field?
I've got some thoughts on that, but maybe I'll just call out to the audience and say that in the last few minutes, we're more than happy to take some of your questions. So if there is something you feel that we've skipped over, audience, please type it into the Q&A. I think one of the responses of governments to this growing loss of jobs by many people is going to be trialed, arguably. And it's about at least a 50% chance, I think, we're going to see a big trial of UBI in a major country between now and 2025. And that could well be in South Korea, where the presidential election is taking place earlier in March. And the front runner is a gentleman called Lee Jae-myung. And he has sometimes been called the Bernie Sanders of South Korea. When he was previously the governor of Gyeonggi province, which is the area around Seoul, but not including Seoul, he did implement a trial of UBI there with special conditions, which meant that people receiving the money had to spend it locally in service of the local business and local community within a given time. So I think he is likely to trial that on a larger scale. And all of us who have been wondering how successful will different forms of UBI be when they are not just a small trial, but scaled up nationwide, we can learn from that. And so we should encourage these experiments. And those of us who fear that we may not get good jobs in the future, of course, we should do the best we can to retrain, but increasingly our best hope may be to adapt into some of these UBI schemes.
The interesting thing there will be what role will the private sector play in the administering of those UBI schemes? Because if you think about the scale of them, most governments wouldn't have the capacity themselves to deliver them, particularly if you extend it to things like universal basic services, like transport, telecoms access, all of those kinds of things. Will we start to see some even bigger monopolies emerge because they have an almost right in perpetuity to provide these services to the community? So I think I agree, UBI, and it probably won't be UBI. I think we talked about this before. It will be some sort of conditional basic income. It will probably be attached to learning of some kind, some retraining, some investment in yourself. And it may only be transitional while you move from one job to the next. But I think we will see a lot more of that. And hopefully some imaginative thinking and some experiments around the world, so that we look at more than one idea for how you do UBI. So we haven't really had any other questions. Everyone's obviously just enwrapped by our conversation. Any closing thoughts, David, as we hit the closing window? And Carl, please join us again if you have any closing thoughts or questions or comments you want to make.
So the one area we haven't talked about is possible new growth industries, where there may be new jobs created at much greater scale. And I think it's quite likely that healthcare is going to be revolutionized and transformed in the next few years as well, partly by applying some of the same methods which helped develop the, say, vaccine so quickly, and partly by breakthroughs with treatments for aging, which is the underlying cause of many of the diseases on which health systems spend so much money. So I think there is prospects of significant business growth in that area, and all companies should at least be thinking, could they play and make a useful contribution there? And many won't be able to, but many might. So we should look at some stage at the other potential growth areas. I think there's a lot to be improved in education as well, frankly. And every discussion about the future, that's a serious discussion about the future, usually ends up talking about reforming education as well. And that's not just a matter of new content, it's a matter of greater personalization of learning for everybody, so that we can all learn more quickly and more effectively.
And maybe we don't all want to learn more quickly, we just want to enjoy the learning process. I'd agree with you on everything there, but I also think that it doesn't necessarily mean we need a massive expansion of learning facilities. If you look at schools, colleges, universities around the country, and everywhere around the world, they're not used very much. There's huge periods of time in the day and in the evenings, at weekends, and holidays where they're not used. And those facilities could be recycled to do adult education, to do continuous education, to do lectures in the middle of the night if you work during the day. We can do an awful lot with what we already have. I think one other thing that I would say on the industries of the future, we tend to look a lot towards the industries of the future, synthetic biology, green technologies, autonomous vehicles. But I think one of the areas where I'm hoping we'll see a massive growth is in the arts. We are likely to have more leisure time, and therefore I think that one of the sectors that we really need to be looking at is how we put more into the creative and performing arts and really expand those and expand the number of job opportunities there, because we'll want to do something with our leisure time beyond just reading and learning Plato all the time. So let's hand it to Carl. Carl, do you have any thoughts you want to add to the conversation before we wave goodbye to our audience? By the way, audience, just on the screen, you can see the events that are coming up. You can go to the website and book into those. We run them at 9 a.m. in the morning on each day, and then again at 6 p.m. As you'll probably realize that they're not exactly the same in the morning and afternoon. It all depends on who's speaking and the conversation we're going to have, but hopefully there'll be as much fun as these. So please do join us for future events. Carl, what would you like?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, guys, for very fruitful discussions of quite a lot of issues. And what a little bit bothers me, well, not bothers me, I'm a little bit concerned that, you know, everybody talking about the climate change, the effect of the climate change of the world and economy and etc. And I'm a little bit worried that we are maybe focusing too much on it. Of course, it's a very important thing. But you mentioned also aging, you mentioned the super intelligence, which have effect on our companies and our society. And then there is this ethical, issues relation to development in the healthcare, etc., etc. I'm not saying that we should not focus on climate change, but there is quite a lot of other issues dealing with in the world, as you have been mentioned, and is, for example, reported in our report of our common agenda, for example. Which we think we should be dealing with together with these issues. Yeah, that's my thought in that respect.
You're entirely right. There are lots of other very big issues, such as the growth and governance of artificial general intelligence, which as you know, Rohit and I are working on a project on exactly that topic now. London Futurists has a meeting this Saturday on exactly that topic as well, which you can find the details online. And ethical issues are paramount. But my justification for looking at climate change isn't I'm looking at linear climate change, which is a steady progress towards maybe 2 or 3 degrees by the end of the century. I'm looking at one of the words on this slide there, exponential. The risk is of an exponential change, rapid climate change, which some of the models predict is possible. And that's that kind of thing which I think deserves more attention, not the linear climate change and straightforward adaptation. It's the shocks and surprises which we need to map out in terms of scenarios. And that, to my mind, doesn't yet have enough attention.
Thank you, David.
Okay, well, I agree also with you, Tolver. I think the art and issue in relation to our leisure time and forward education mindset, dealing with changes and so on is quite important. But from me, I'm very pleased with the session and. So I think that's my last word.
Okay, well, we've just had a question. So obviously people are welcome to leave at any time, much like in any aspect of life. But we have a really nice question that's come in from Gayenal Rice. Hopefully I haven't slaughtered your name there. And the question is, how will corruption in business and government play out? I think this is causing a lot of resentment as it becomes more and more apparent to people. David, your thoughts?
Oh, I thought you were going to answer that one first, Rohit.
You want me to go first? I think we're going to see more and more challenge. Coming from the UK, we're in a very interesting situation right now where all sorts of things are being questioned about government behaviour, leaving aside whether Boris Johnson was at parties or not, things about the procurement behaviour for PPE, the awarding of government contracts, the payment of or MPs doing work outside Parliament, and to what extent that's buying influence. I think all of those things are there. And then we hear more and more often of how contracts were really awarded way after the event and companies willing to bend the rules to get that. I don't know whether we can get to a stronger moral and ethical framework that really drives transparency. Something like blockchain technology on these things might work. So if you take, for example, government minister or government ministers and members of parliament working for external parties, all of the contracting could be done through a transparent blockchain type solution. So you could see exactly what was happening. The amounts could be fixed. The amount of time you could work could be fixed. So we could put some rules in and some structures, because what we found is that every time we tried to push back, Parliament itself has rejected these constraints and has watered down any attempts to limit their potential to extract additional revenues, and that we see all around the world. So I'm not hopeful right now that we're going to get there quickly, but I am desirous that we get to something in the longer term. And the more the public knows about these things, the more transparency there is, the more you have projects like the Good Law projects here in the UK that try and identify and profile these examples. Maybe we'll get to a better state, but I do think money is so powerful here that it's going to be hard to constrain it.
It is a credibly important topic. There is growing resentment, there's growing alienation, there's growing frustration. More and more people feel that they have been left behind, not just in terms of how much money they can earn, but they are being taken advantage of. Their routes to greater recognition has been reduced. And we must address this. Transparency is part of the answer, I believe. But the other thing is the society as a self. Society as a whole must decide what it values, and it should pay attention to what we value. So rather than still living under the tyranny of the GDP metric, which measures how much economic transactions there are, which is important, but it's only a part of what's important about society. And we must elevate to a much greater extent metrics that focus on ethical behaviors and happiness and well-being. And when that happens, then whenever people are falling short, it'll no longer be excusable for them to say, hey, we're doing this because we're going to be successful from a financial point of view. That won't be acceptable. So part of driving out these bad behaviors is a renewed agreement on what truly matters, which is what you were saying in any case, Rohit, is what companies need to do. I think it's more than just what companies need to do. It's what countries and whole society needs to do. We need to rediscover our ethical roots and ensure they don't get lost under a rush to financial profits and consumer pleasures.
And for all that we criticize social media and we have a downer on some aspects of it, it is a platform to try and create these conversations. And I'd also say the same for the media itself. We're seeing more and more campaigning activity in the media around different causes. Today, a lot of it's environmental. So in the UK, we see Sky has been doing a lot around ocean health. They're now focusing on climate change a lot. I don't know whether you'd see any of the media organizations go that far and be bold enough to take on issues of corruption and transparency. But if they did, they have a very powerful convening agency there, and that could be helpful. But we do need a number of these mechanisms to work, to start the new conversations, to catalyze action, to put pressure on those in power and to drive real change, for sure. Carl, any thoughts on corruption before we close the doors on this evening's conversation?
Well, I think that is an issue which is compelling in many of the society, and because of also the flow of information between countries and all over the global system, it is, and transparency, it is getting more and more issue, and it will be, and is taking on in the social media and is blowing up. So that's good, and but it needs to be seen how it will develop.
Great. Well, thank you both. I think we should let someone else has popped up with a question. Gernal saying thank you. Great discussion. So thank you all for coming. Thank you both for being part of this session. Thank you to everyone who's been listening. Hope you found it of interest, and do please tell your friends about it if you think it'd be worth them joining the future sessions. You can sign up for those events at the website link shown below. You only have to sign up for one, then you'll automatically be registered for everything else. So we look forward to seeing you next week, for those of you who will be joining us. Thanks very much. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much, Rohit.
Thank
Very
you,
well
guys.
moderated.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.